Good afternoon, wherever you are. This is Madeline Yates with Campus Compact Mid-Atlantic, and we're very pleased to co-sponsor with Middle States Commission for Higher Education and New Jersey Campus Compact, along with Pennsylvania and New York, this guided conversation number 4 around community and civic engagement initiatives through the lenses of standards 6 and 7. So thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to have this team of speakers with us on the panel, and let me go through some initial introductions. Please make sure that if you need access to closed captioning, the button is there on your screen, and we really encourage you to use the Q&A function so that this can be indeed a conversation with you as well. Even if we're unable to get to your question, we will gather those questions and try to execute a response down the road. These webinars are recorded and are available on the Campus Compact Mid-Atlantic website. So with that, the purpose of these conversations is really to look at the intersection of civic and community engagement and how it can be useful in addressing and meeting the standards. And not just the student learning outcome standards, but all of the standards. So specific to the lenses of standards 6 and 7 today. With us, we have Paul Starkey from the Middle States Commission for Higher Education, Dr. Javidan Rodriguez, and Michelle McDonald, Merida Wilda Colon, and Dr. Roger Ward, also from the University of Maryland, Baltimore. So we are truly honored. Everyone's bios are also available on our website, so we won't go into them since they are robust. With that, I would like Dr. Starkey to pass the floor to you to offer some framing.
Well, thank you, Madeline. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be part of this panel. I know many of the panelists and I'm honored to be included in it. So I was preceded in the other guided conversations by my colleagues, Dr. Ellie Fogarty and Dr. Edna Corbett. So they expressed in those guided conversations that an institution accredited by Middle States Commission on Higher Education can state with confidence, when our students are well served, society is well served. And I think that's a powerful comment. So serving our students has become much more difficult in this past year, but our students are in ever greater need for such service due to the stressors of life in this pandemic. So a refresher to the last guided conversation. Dr. Corbett shared with you that our institutions, when going through self-study, identify and develop priorities for their self-study. And 3 of the 4 most popular priorities among our member institutions are related to the well-being of our students and also to the purpose and mission of Campus Compact. And these are diversity, equity, inclusion, improving student achievement, and developing community and strategic partnerships. So with these types of priorities, there should be a clear connection to the goals of Campus Compact. And I'm very pleased to frame this through the lens of standards 6 and 7. So you'll recall that Ellie talked about 1 and 2, mission and goals, ethics and integrity. And Edna covered 3, the core curriculum, 4, the support of students through this, and 5, assessment. So 6 and 7 are talking about planning and resource allocation, and then about the leadership and the governance of our organizations. So let me start with standard 6. It states the institution's planning processes, resources, and structures are aligned with each other and are sufficient to fulfill its mission and goals to continuously assess and improve its programs and services, and probably most importantly, to respond effectively to opportunities and challenges. So this truly is where the rubber meets the road. Middle States' expectation is that the institution provides appropriate resources. This could be physical resources, fiscal resources, human infrastructure, technology, but you must provide the appropriate resources to achieve your goal. So clearly, if a school indicates that civic and community engagement, that involvement in those around us is part of our priorities, then there must be a clear link to plans, and the adequate resources have to be made available. So two key elements in Standard 6 is that the institution clearly makes civic and community engagement a key part of what they do, and that those goals align with the mission of the institution. This is the how do we know portion of assessment. Secondly, the institution has to allocate the appropriate resources. This is the how do we show element of assessment. We've all seen worthy ideas that have never been developed for lack of resources. Now, do the plans have to rise to the strategic level? Not necessarily, but if you wish to have a broad impact in educating your students and developing them into civically minded people and graduates, then you have to have a level of planning and the allocation of resources that will facilitate that implementation. And recall that the resources can come in different forms. Yeah, we always think about money, but it's also about time and staffing considerations and space and technology. If you tell me that engagement is an important goal of your institution, yet implementation is given to an overloaded staff member with no time or resources, then you've shown me that that's not an important goal. So Standard 7 is about leadership and administration. And it states that the institution is governed and administered in a manner that allows it to realize its stated mission and goals in a way that effectively benefits the institution, its students, and other constituencies it serves. It goes on with some details about non-interference, but still, and the other constituencies it serves. It's lumping the institution, our students, and our other constituencies. The impact of the governing body and leadership of the organization, it's crucial to the success of any community or civic engagement effort. Grassroots efforts are laudable. We love when faculty or staff members take on a particular cause on their own, but rarely are we able to grow those grassroots efforts into something that can be broadly adopted across our organizations. Senior leadership has to understand, support, and champion these efforts. So the standards of middle states they all have specific criteria within the standards. And criterion 4A requires administration should regularly engage with faculty and students in advancing the institution's goals and objectives. This calls for leadership by example. So if we are to say that engagement, civic and community engagement is important for us, then we should show that it's important by doing so. And then our governing body, our boards of trustees, our boards of directors, our system boards, if they endorse engagement as a strategic level of initiative, then it sends in a message to the entire institution of the legitimacy of these efforts. And this provides the imperative to move forward. In short, the commission standards, especially those related to leadership, planning, and resource allocation, are well suited to support the efforts of Campus Compact. And recall that the commission standards are always applied through the lens of the institution's mission, so that it applies to institutions regardless of where you are or what your overall purpose is. And if at the highest levels of the organization, you've made the commitment to community and civic engagement, then the standards provide the mechanism to guide those efforts. So I thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. And I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Madeline Rodriguez, the president of the University of Albany, who also happens to be a commissioner within the Middle States. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to Middle States and Campus Compact for convening this very timely and important conversation. We at the University at Albany are very proud of our affiliation with both entities. Actually, back in 2018, not too long ago, we collaborated with Campus Compact on a 2-day workshop for colleges and universities interested in pursuing the Carnegie Classification for Community Engagement. I'm very pleased to report that UAlbany recently received the classification for community engagement in the spring of 2020, meeting one of our institution's key engagement and service goals. Also, UAlbany just completed our reaccreditation process with Middle States in 2020. Thus, having recently completed our Carnegie classification as an engaged university, having gone through the Middle States reaccreditation process, and as Paul mentioned, currently serving as a Middle States commissioner, I want to underscore the how do you show or prove it component of this question as it relates to these two standards. And first, we all know you document. Evidence is instrumental to prove your case. You also show clear and effective strategies or concrete evidence in which you have invested actual resources to support community engagement. You demonstrate your concrete assessment strategies and outcomes. Effective assessment, as we all know, is of paramount importance. We also clearly outline, again with concrete evidence, how you have changed or improved your approaches over time. Finally, while we are always keen to know about your future strategies and plans, we really want to know about what you actually accomplished. What have you done? How have you measured its effectiveness? And what have you implemented to improve outcomes? And so here at the University at Albany, we are committed to continuous improvement by upholding the standards set forward both by the Carnegie Foundation's community engagement framework as well as those of Middle States. For both the Carnegie classification and our Middle States reaccreditation, we had to clearly demonstrate this and provide concrete evidence of implementation as well as demonstrating effective review and assessment processes. So in terms of responding in response to effective opportunities, to effectively respond to opportunities and strategies, I should say, in regards to Standard 6, we know because we have intentionally created and continuously reinforced concrete university-wide practices. We show by putting our resources behind our strategic goals and by achieving the objectives we set for ourselves. So in terms of planning, our strategic plan is grounded on 5 core priorities, one of which is engagement and service. We also expect all our schools, colleges, and administrative divisions to develop action plans that address our 5 core priorities, including engagement and service. In terms of resource allocation, at UAlbany, we align decision-making with our strategic plan priorities by putting resources into projects and approaches that reflect our commitment to engagement and service. The university has also developed a dedicated infrastructure for community engagement led by our Office of Public Engagement. And actually, over the past 2 fiscal years, UAlbany has invested over $3 million in new funding to jumpstart initiatives related to our strategic priorities, focusing and including community engagement initiatives. In terms of other concrete and exciting initiatives, because people want to hear about these types of initiatives as it relates to Standard 6 and Standard 7, and particularly as they relate to community engagement and service, especially now in the times of COVID, our faculty and several colleges and students created, for example, thousands of medical face shields, which were distributed to hospitals and health centers across the capital region. Researchers from our School of Public Health and the RNA Institute were quickly able to pivot their research to tackle pressing issues regarding COVID-19, including detection, transmission, and treatment. And we worked hand in hand with state and county health officials, providing expertise and support in the response to this pandemic. Also, the state of New York commissioned UAlbany to lead research into the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on communities of color. So now we have an interdisciplinary research team of 37, I should say, faculty and researchers distributed across 8 colleges working on how COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted communities of color. In terms of our continuous engagement with our communities, the university is holding here in our main campus the COVID-19 test site, as well as a vaccination site to serve our communities throughout the capital region and beyond. Actually, just this morning, we were at the vaccination site celebrating with state staff and the National Guard 100,000 shots into people's arms since we started this process a couple of months ago. Also, just moving away from COVID now, as a president of UAlbany and as a so-called expert in the research field of disasters, I co-led a SUNY-wide initiative that led to the participation of about 34 SUNY campuses and over 1,000 faculty, staff, and students that were deployed to Puerto Rico, focusing on relief and recovery efforts following the impact of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And finally, another example, the University at Albany was a co-founder, and I served as one of the inaugural co-chairs of the New York Capital Region Higher Education Council, which is an association of 24 colleges and universities and the chief executive officers, the presidents from throughout the capital region in Northern New York, that we get together on a regular basis to address the issues and challenges and opportunities of higher education here in the capital region. So those are some concrete examples of how we have implemented our commitment with concrete strategic initiatives to serve our communities based on these 2 standards. So now I'm going to pass it on to Drs. McDonald and Colon from Stockton University.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start the conversation and then pass it over to Awilda. We're going to be tag teaming this one. There's going to be some ideas that resonate with what Albany has already been accomplishing. In 2017, Stockton launched its new mission, vision, and value statements. It had been a while since we'd updated them, and it was so important to us to embed community engagement within these ideas that you can see them up front from the outset. So if you start with our mission statement, it is very clearly to develop engaged and effective citizens with a commitment to lifelong learning and a capacity to change in a multicultural and interdependent world. And then when you move down to our value statements, we had 10. And very much like Albany, we wanted community engagement and civic responsibility to be embedded within the threads, the woven fabric of who we were from this inaugural statement of institutional identity. And so we have community engagement and civic responsibility and our commitment to positive development in Southern New Jersey through research and through teaching and through partnerships and through economic investment as one of our core values. This emphasis shouldn't be surprising, given Stockton's longstanding commitment to community engagement. We've been recognized by Carnegie as an engaged campus more than once, most recently as was Albany in January of 2020. And we are currently going through our Middle States process. So this conversation is very timely for us, because I kind of feel that by going through how we've embedded it within our mission, vision, and values, how we've had this sort of longstanding commitment and have grown the number of engagement projects and student and faculty opportunities, that I've really well touched on standards 1 and standards 3. But I'm very mindful that we're actually talking about standard 6 and standard 7. And so that's where I want to focus the rest of my comments before I pass it to Maria de Colon. Thinking about standard 6, right? Standard 6 is really looking at the ways in which an institution dedicates its resources, and has been mentioned. These need not necessarily be dollars. So I'm going to choose some very specific examples, and I know that Awilda has some others in which she's going to elaborate. So one of the ways in which I feel Stockton can demonstrate what it knows and can demonstrate and show what it's committed to is in identifying spaces and resources to support our community engagement initiatives. Right? It's not just that we support them in our campus spaces, but it requires that we go to where our community partners are, where our communities, families live, and dedicate spaces for off-campus instruction, classroom spaces, office spaces, storage spaces. And here I'll tell one interesting story. Parking spaces. It really means knowing who your community is. So one of my title, I'm the Chief Academic Officer for our Atlantic City campus. And that's where Wilda does some of her best work. She has her naturalization class there. And I got a call from her one day. This seems simple, but it wasn't simple. It was necessary, right? I got a call from her one day that said, Michelle, we're having a problem. We have some folks in our naturalization class and they're not able to park in the parking lot directly behind campus because that's limited to Stockton faculty and staff. And yet a number of these are older individuals or individuals for whom English is a challenge. And so asking them to park down the block in a multi-story parking garage, navigate their way over and get a parking validation is going to be a challenge. It's going to dissuade them from coming. So I went to our university facilities folks and I said, this seems like it's very small, but I need you to make an exception. And I can tell you we can support this very easily. This isn't going to cost us anything, right? We're talking about a handful of spaces at a time in the evening when we're not in high demand. Isn't there some way that we can set up a system whereby we can meet our community where they need to be in this building, right? They're making a step by coming into our campus, right? But to make it as easy as possible for them. And with that small step, we opened up the doors literally and the parking arm, literally, to those who could best benefit from a program which they really critically needed to move forward on their pathway to citizenship. I'm also going to talk about just two other examples. Sometimes it means rethinking the resources that you have at your own institution. So within the last year and a half, this began in the time before COVID, we began to rethink how we approach both service learning and community engagement. One really had an interior orientation, one really, that's service learning. Community engagement was really engaging much more in an exterior way, but we had the opportunity to sit down and ask ourselves, wouldn't we have a broader, better synergy if we brought these offices together? And that meant really thinking about resources in a variety of ways. It meant rethinking our personnel resources, our human resources, and many thanks to Dr. Colon for agreeing to spearhead both of those initiatives as they now report up to her. Previously, she had directed our Stockton Center for Community Engagement. By having those both on and taking a look at the staff and taking a look at their expertise, we were able to begin to weave, and I say begin to weave because the personnel merger process, well, where were we in March of 2020? We were this close, right? We were this close, right? So it's a work in progress as we move toward reopening in the fall of 2021. And we are in fact have merged the offices. We have brought the staff together. We have begun to rethink their initiatives. We won't really be able to see the fruition of that initiative until we move a bit further down the line in terms of returning to what will be our new normal sometime in 2021. But it's just something to think about because it meant thinking about space, physical space on campus to bring these offices together, personnel space, student resource and access to other kinds of temporary employment money or student support, federal work study money, and how we could take and leverage that as much as possible in a time of challenging resources this year. And then the final example I'll use for Standard 6, and then I want to pass it on. Is it really means paying attention to how you can partner meaningfully with other entities within your area. So Stockton has been named an anchor institution in Atlantic City, and it's something that we take very seriously. We sit on the Atlantic City Executive Council, which is spearheaded by the Lieutenant Governor of the state as one of many for-profit, nonprofit, and municipal entities trying to address issues within the city. We sit on the Governor's Restart and Recovery task force teams to address those issues as well and think about how to develop and foster economic development within Atlantic City. But we also want to partner with other key entities within the city. And one great example is the Boys and Girls Club. So we have a great social work program. We have a wonderful undergraduate social work program and a thriving master's degree in social work. What we needed more of in the city was access to social work resources. But rather than create it within our own campus setting, we went to where the students and their families already had strong connections. And that was the Boys and Girls Club of Atlantic City. And we operate our own social work clinic there. It's a win-win for everybody. It provides resources resources for the institution. They provide the space, we provide the personnel, we provide the students, they provide clinical placements, which our students need in order to succeed within their degree. And it's a great way of thinking about how you can take community engagement and meaningfully leverage the resources of multiple entities in order to make them successful. So I want to pass it on to Awilda because I think I've taken more of our 5 minutes than I should.
Along the lines of everything that Michelle eloquently related to you, we have really anchored ourselves on assessment and have really counted on the rigor of assessment and the administrative support to continue our civic and community engagement initiatives, showing then our transformational work to embed community and civic engagement in the culture of Stockton. When you think of collective impact, what Michelle just described with our partnership with the Boys and Girls Club of Atlantic City shows having this reciprocal relationship where Stockton is partnering to create programs, to sustain programs, and to bring social services and social work to the community. Similarly, the Stockton Center for Community Engagement and Service Learning has served as the backbone partner with the police department of Atlantic City and Pleasantville to bring after-school programming to children that otherwise wouldn't necessarily have access, to be tutored by a police officer, to be tutored by a Stockton student. And I know that in previous conversations, we have wanted to hear about what happens when things don't work well. And it did happen for us. We began this partnership with the police department funded by the Attorney General's office back in 2014. And when there was a change in governors, there were changes in funding structure. So the initial funds we lost. They went to other initiatives. But Stockton University, again, thinking of that standard 6 and standard 7, how the resources are allocated, and then what leadership supports that those resources be spent in the ways in which show our commitment to civic and community engagement. We were quickly able to have the resources internally to continue our work as a backbone partner in this reciprocal relationship with the police department. And not only the police department in both towns, but also the housing authority and city government. So that was one instance where we knew, and something of a best practice is any grant, any initiative we pursue, we should always come to it thinking, what happens if funding is lost? Do we have what we need? And do we have the support of the Board of Trustees to say, yes, it's fine that the administration of the university pivots in terms of funding strategies and where the funding is allocated. And another example I want to give you, I know we have heard about Carnegie and being reclassified as Carnegie designated community engaged institution. We found ourselves in preparing for the reclassification in a situation where we had to assess the institutional assessment measures we use. And we had to look at a measure that could actually give us findings of what's the impact of all this civic and community engagement from the perspective of the partners, the students, the faculty, and the staff. So creating this kind of assessment plan and involving faculty, partners, students, all our partners from the community were key in this as well, was monumental. So when things don't go well, the university again has to align the resources, the planning, and that leadership support. So with that, I want to pass to Dr. Ward.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. One of the benefits you have when you go follow such outstanding presentations, you get to say ditto. We do those things too. But of course, we all do them in our own way, in a different context and in different places. UMB, I'm at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and UMB, just as Stockton, is an anchor institution in the city of Baltimore. We're in the heart of Baltimore City. We're on the west side. Our colleagues, Johns Hopkins, is on the east side. And starting 10 years ago, when our new president came, at that time, Dr. J. Perman, who is now Chancellor of the University System, President Perman made a priority for the institution. And so this goes to our mission, that given where we are as an institution, given that we're a graduate and professional campus with 6 professional schools and a graduate schools, and among those schools having medicine, nursing, pharmacy, dentistry, social work, law, graduate school, and that compilation of school, and with the assets that we have and our especially as it relates to being able to provide not only clinical care, but also counseling and legal advice through our law clinics and so on to the community, that we should really, really embrace our status as an anchor institution. And not only by articulating that we're an anchor institution and we're committed to our community, and in particular the West Baltimore community, but as it relates to our strategic plan, making sure that that was written into our plan as a strategic priority. The very first theme in our strategic plan adopted under President Perman is health, justice, and social impact. And all the strategic priorities and outcomes under that particular theme focused on our status as an anchor institution and the obligations we had to helping to empower the communities that we were a part of as the university. And flowing from that, of course, having to do with Standard 6, the allocation of resources, Dr. Perman used to always say, still says in his role as Chancellor, no money, no mission. So in as much as our mission is to improve the human condition, and in as much as we write into our strategic plan a theme focused on social impact and community impact, unless we then reallocated resources, raised new money to support the goals in our strategic plan in furtherance of that theme, it was just lip service. And so he really pushed us. And of course, we're a state entity. We receive a state appropriation. The state of Maryland has been generous to Maryland institutions in its state appropriation for higher ed. But like so many of the institutions across the higher education landscape, we too have had financial struggles at different times over these past 10 years. And you've got to make decisions. And we always would say, what your priorities are when you have to cut a budget, and what you decide to cut and what you decide to continue to fund. And I'm pleased to say as UMB, we were always able to sustain our funding and our support and our resourcing of community engagement. And that resourcing included starting a new community engagement center. First, a small building that we occupied and located in West Baltimore. And proud to say that over the last year, even during the pandemic, we opened a brand new community engagement center 4 to 5 times the size of where we were before, and hired new staff to staff that facility. And that, again, was because of the strategic priorities we had laid out in support of our anchor institution priorities in our strategic plan. One of the other things that we focused on doing was making sure that we were able to measure the impact of what we were doing. Because what we found, even before Dr. Perman came here, and the deans were sure to point that out, listen, we've all been engaged in community activities and work in our community for a very, very long time. What we couldn't do as an institution was articulate exactly what that work was. We could do it in our individual silos, but we couldn't really articulate and assess the impact of it. And so we spent the last 10 years trying to put systems in place, cataloging what our activities are, bringing more coordination to those activities, and standing up programs where we could demonstrate and measure the impact of what we're doing. I think I mentioned on the pre-call that we're in the midst now of our writing our new strategic plan for the next 5 years. And we always start with a review of our mission, which is to improve the human condition. Then we turn to our values to see if we still think they're relevant and current, and we're in the midst of perhaps tweaking and revising those. And the very first value as a community that people say we need to make much clearer is, and write in as a value, not just as a theme in our strategic plan, is social and community impact. And I suspect that that is going to end up being one of our core values as an institution. And then that would allow us to continue to build on the work we have done with our community engagement center. It's going to help us to build on the work we're doing in Promise Heights, where we're dealing with infant mortality. It's going to help us to build on the COVID vaccination clinic that we stood up with Baltimore City for the sole purpose of vaccinating underrepresented populations in the city. If you listen to Baltimore news, you hear the mayor talk all the time about vaccine inequity. And so we are engaged with the city in helping to address those concerns. So I'm pleased to be a part of the compact, to have received its support, and it is good, and be the beneficiary as an institution of its good work over all these years, because it has certainly helped us move the needle and bring some focus to our efforts as a community engaged institution.
Dr. Ward, thank you. You demonstrated and talked a lot about how you have allocated resources to different things that are a priority under the previous strategic plan. Have you learned anything from the data you gathered about how you're going to allocate resources through the new plan to reflect your civic and community engagement goals?
Yes, as a matter of fact, just earlier today, I came off a meeting with the president and our chief business and finance officer. Our chief business and finance officer is about to send out an email to the deans and vice president what we're proposing for our FY22 budget. This is a tough budget year for us. As I mentioned before, because of COVID, the state had to reduce our budget for as a state enterprise, and that was done across the board. So we're trying to figure out how to build that into our FY22 budget. So we could only focus on a handful of priorities. And one of those priorities is including base funding, $300,000 on an annual basis to support the work of the Community Engagement Center. And so that's a value decision, budget decision, resource decision that we made in consultation with the deans and vice president, because we view that as a priority. And that's just one of among 5 priorities that we said that in this current budget, as tight as it is, that we have to continue to support as a strategic priority. And that community engagement was one of them. I think speaks volumes to where we are in terms of being committed to that ideal.
And to your leadership, it's the priorities that you must feel stretched and pulled in so many directions means that you have to pick and choose. And so it's a statement of what you value. And similarly, Dr. Rodriguez, you mentioned, I think you said a $3 million investment that included civic and community engagement, and that you require your departments to develop action plans that have embedded in them civic and community engagement goals. How do you determine, based on those processes, how you allocate specific resources? Maybe you could give us a few examples.
Thank you for the question. So one of the things that we do, when I got here, arrived as president 3.5 years ago, we established our strategic plan, which there was just widespread community participation from faculty, staff, and students. As I said before, we established 5 core priorities, and community engagement and service is one of them, included with 4 others. And we also established a committee that would review and assess every year our progress regarding the goals, the metrics of our strategic plan, and where we're heading. As a part of this process, we created two programs. One is what we call an accelerator grant program, in which we have calls for proposals for the entire university, and you submit proposals to the to this committee or task force. They review them based on the metrics of the 5 core priorities that we have, and we select a number of projects which we will fund. The other program that we started, we call STAR, Strategic Allocation of Resources. And it's the same thing. We award, we put aside a certain amount of funding. Between the two, we have now, as I said before, put aside $3.3 million, and we asked the university for proposals. This year, for example, we just sent out the call for proposals last week, and our focus is one of our core priorities: diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so we review the proposals, we see the metrics that are put forward and the projects that are put forward align with our strategic plan, and the task force makes recommendations to me in terms of what we approve. We also have the task force do an assessment strategy to see what is the impact of these programs and how we are moving forward, because the goal is that the STAR allocation or the other resource allocation program are just seed funding with the intention that if these projects are successful, we will build them into permanent institutional funds to continue to fund these initiatives along the 5 core priorities that I talked about.
Thanks, and I'm seeing a lot of nodding around the webinar. Perhaps Dr. McDonald or Dr. Cologne, you'd like to follow up on that. And before you do, I just want to say that I'm quite aware of a lot of what's happening at Stockton, and consider it beyond an anchor institution to be a real lighthouse in South Jersey. And I commend you for the work you're doing.
Thank you. We were nodding. I think we were probably both nodding our heads, because this is a moment of institutional joy. So one of the downsides of COVID-19, and I'm sure that many of our institutions went through them, when the world turned in March of 2020, we also faced some pretty significant challenges. One of which was a 25% reduction in state appropriation for that year. Right. And so everybody had to get together and have a really frank conversation about what could be supported and what couldn't be supported. And some of the programs that we would, and some of them were logistical, right? We had a lot of internal grant programs as well. And they couldn't support the kinds of work or research or travel that they might have supported, because we couldn't do that kind of activity anymore. And so we had we drew the line for fall of 21. The reason I'm smiling is because we're reopening those doors now for FY22, right? So we've relaunched our faculty fellows program, which is one of the other ways we dedicate resources to try to support initiatives around campus. And Awilda routinely gets 2 faculty fellows who bring their ideas and their enthusiasm and their connections to the Stockton Center for Community Engagement and Service Learning, and help to work with our students. We've relaunched our Summer Institute program, which are professional development series, often led by faculty, sometimes led by staff, to re-energize areas in different ways. And diversity, equity, inclusion are 2 of our major areas. We are just in the process of passing a state institutional graduation requirement for the study of race and social justice. And that requires a really quick reassessment of what we have on the curriculum, and an equally quick but thorough assessment of what we need in the curriculum to make that happen. Speaking of resources, meant a dedicated person who helped to found our Africana Studies program, guide us through this process. And we're in the final stages of making that happen. And then we also have an institution level, the same, I think, a very similar project to what Albany has. It used to be called our 2020 Fund, because it was aligned with our 2020 strategic plan. Our new strategic plan, which just launched a little over a year ago, is called Choosing Our Path. So this is the Compass Fund. It's all sort of navigational and directional, our Compass Fund. And we're just beginning to put together the call for proposals for Compass funding. So I think these are wonderful ways in which the Compass funding can be a collaboration. It doesn't have to be purely campus-based. There has to be a campus partner, but it can also align with external entities. And so it's a way of really thinking about how to leverage the university's resources to create pilot programs, and then while they're searching for other potential sources of either institutional support or external support to try to further our mission in a variety of different ways. Awilda, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add.
Well, mentioning how our 2020 strategic plan out of that plan, the Center for Community Engagement and Service Learning was born. And then now that we know we've been able to work on this transformation in terms of our culture, we don't need to have a pillar specifically as we did in the 2020 strategic plan for community and civic engagement, but we now can use the civic and community engagement that is already embedded in our culture at the institution to contribute to these curricular initiatives of racial justice and to continue to support, particularly now in the Compass level of funding, initiatives that tie to diversity and inclusion, because we have found, even when you look at scholarship of engagement, that diverse faculty, staff, students tend to do a lot of work in scholarship of civic and community engagement. So we have been able to see that transformation and how we have embedded the civic and community engagement at the institution.
And if I can just add one other thing, we've talked a lot about Standard 6. Just a quick note about Standard 7. I think it's important that that Awilda, in her role as Executive Director for the Stockton Center for Community Engagement and Service Learning, reports directly to the Office of the Provost and sits on the Provost Council. And she also sits on the President's Leadership Council. What this means is that she has access to pan-institutional information on a regular basis. The Leadership Council meets after every board meeting, so 5 times a year. Provost Council meets once a month, but she has also biweekly access then to the Provost's office. And I think it's important to have that level of administrative governance commitment because it gives her access to information, which is an extraordinarily valuable resource, and also makes certain that upper administration is aware of her initiatives and those with whom she works and those with whom she partners.
And so that representation is very important. Sorry, does somebody want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted, if you don't mind, Saul, I wanted just to highlight an issue that both Michelle and Roger highlighted, which is that of resources. I don't think any of our institutions sits in an abundance of money. Quite the contrary. We are at the University at Albany. We are dealing right now with a $46 million deficit. So that's been the impact primarily of COVID-19. However, as an institution, we have decided that despite dealing with this shortfall, budget shortfall, there are strategic initiatives that we want to continue to invest in. And so when you say that in the middle of a financial crisis, in the middle of COVID, you are investing in civic and community engagement, or you are investing in diversity, equity, and inclusion, that speaks very loudly to the core priorities of the institution, right? So at the end of the day, regardless of the funding that you have or don't have, you have to be intentional in terms of what you want to do. You want to be strategic, and everybody at you already knows that, my goal is we're guided by our strategic plan, and you have to focus on those initiatives that truly have an impact, in this case, in terms of civic and community engagement. So I think that regardless of our financial circumstances, there are initiatives and there are projects that we can develop that can build on our priorities and that meet and are really well aligned to Standard 6 and 7.
Thank you. And I would echo that in a way that not only are these investments important for how we graduate students from our campuses and how we consider our role as citizens within our communities, but doing this work well gives students the chance to develop the kinds of skills that will allow them to thrive when they graduate anyway. So to me, it's a win-win-win, and I think the research is starting to bear that out.
I saw an interesting question, and maybe it was from Madeline in the chat, having to do with the evaluation of the CEO president on these issues having to do with institutional priorities. And it's a good question because, again, just as my colleagues have said, and Dr. Rodriguez just highlighted, when you're dealing with a budget crisis and deficits and shortfalls, and you're still finding ways to invest in priorities that are important to you, like DEI and community and civic engagement, that speaks volumes, and it sends a message that those things are important. But another important way that you demonstrate a commitment to your priorities is that when they show up in your president's goals. Mm-hmm. And for which he or she may be held accountable either by a board or, in our case, the Chancellor and the Board of Regents at the University System of Maryland. So I recently, and this is a role I've had under when President Perman was President Perman, but he's now Chancellor Perman. We now have President Bruce Gerald as the president. I work with the president to develop his annual goals that then get sent to the Chancellor, reviewed, and if accepted, would be the goals that the president would be evaluated on for the upcoming year by the Chancellor and the Board of Regents. And the number one goal, as it was the case with when Dr. Perman was president, had to do with our commitment to community engagement. He always insisted that there be goals in there written into his annual evaluation, the goals that he set for himself with the Chancellor around community engagement and community impact. And that has certainly carried over with President Gerald. So just last week, when we submitted his goals to the system for next year, chief among them were goals having to do with community engagement. And you better believe Chancellor Perman next year, when he sits with President Gerald, is going to say, so tell me how you did. And so when you write these goals into your leader's evaluation, and he or she knows that they will be evaluated on those things remain a priority. And when you have a leader who's willing to have those be set as goals for him or her, that too speaks volumes to the community.
Thanks, Dr. Ward. And goals and metrics obviously give presidents the kind of feedback they crave and need. Community voice can also be a different and important way to provide a clarity and a different metric for providing a sense of how the culture of the institution resonates and responds with community voice. So to Dr. Ward, while you were speaking, do you have an example or a way of talking about how community voice is integrated into the governance at UMB?
So, governance have a very specific term in the academy, as you well know. And when we think of governance, we think of our faculty senate, at least in our instance, our staff senate, and our student senate. So that's in the strict academic sense. But then in the broader governance sense, our priorities and our plans, we always socialize them with the community. And by socialize, I don't mean say, these are our plans, this is what we're going to do. And it's informative. It's really, this is what we're thinking. This is what we want to do. How could these plans be made better? And how could they be impactful if they were to be developed? And we invite feedback from the community to provide us with those plans. So for example, through our Community Engagement Center, there's an organization in our neighborhood called the Southwest Partnership, that those members sit on the advisory board for the Community Engagement Center. So any ideas, initiatives, and programs that we do out of the Community Engagement Center, these individuals who are residents of these communities where these programs would be implemented, provide impact and help shape these programs. So that's on the programmatic side. Even with our research, we have a program out of our School of Pharmacy called the Patients Program. And that program is all about, as we are designing research that involves the community is invited to participate in every phase of the project, from writing the research protocol to working it through the IRB, providing feedback to the investigators on the protocol, and then when approved by the IRB, in implementation, and helping us, guide us as to how we should go about collecting data in the community, with the community. And then once we collect that data, how do we then share it back with the community so that the loop is closed relative to this is what we have learned, this is the knowledge and the discoveries we've made on account of the research that was done. How could we then translate this so that it benefits the community? So we're not engaging the community in research just to generate knowledge, and then there's no translation back to the community where there are real benefits to the community. So those are just some of the key ways in which we make sure that community voice shows up on the program side, on the research side at UMB.
Thank you. And given that time is against us, would anybody else like to follow up on Dr. Ward's response about community voice in governance?
I'd just like to highlight the same issue that Dr. Ward mentioned. That said, for us, and I keep highlighting within the university and in the community that we are the only public Research One institution in the capital region. So as a Research One institution, I see that we have a high responsibility to engage with our communities and get them engaged in a number of initiatives. And so, for example, our university council, we don't have a board at UAlbany because there's a board for SUNY, but our university council, which serves sort of as a board, are members of our community that provide feedback and input in terms of what we do moving forward on a number of strategic initiatives. Our Center for the Elimination of Minority Health Disparities has a board that has faculty, staff, and members of the community, again, to allow us to focus on the issues that are impacting our communities of color. And then as president, I sit on a number of boards here in the Capital Region. For example, the Capital Region Economic Development Council, which I co-chair, and these are 9 regions across the state of New York. And we manage a hefty amount of funds. The year before last, we were managing over $80 million, focusing on economic development for the Capital Region, right? So you engage, and this is a board that I co-lead with a number of folks from across the entire Capital Region, focusing on the economic development of our Capital Region. So that is critical that we do that. But one last thing I want to emphasize, because one of the critical components is how do we also recognize and reward community engagement, civic and community engagement in our universities and campuses. And one of the initiatives that we established actually several years ago is the President's Award for Exemplary Public Engagement. And every year we recognize 5 to 7 projects in which you have real projects with real and active community partners with real impacts. And so this is a way in which you engage the community in working with our faculty and serving our communities. One of the examples was the Capital District Writing Project, which we awarded last year in partnership with the School of Education here at UAlbany and the Shenandoah High School, among other community partners. So how do we develop those projects and recognize our faculty and staff for the work that they do in this arena?
Thank you. We have 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask just for one response so that we have time to give that response a chance to be fleshed out a little bit. We talked before we came online about, well, what can Campus Compact do as it relates to civic and community engagement efforts in support of one's accreditation self-studies. And there was mention of the act of being able to catalog good practices, and that those practices could be reflected upon by different campuses as you see fit, to see how certain things enhanced one's self-studies in relation to the different standards. Would anybody like to flesh that out a little bit? Prompt Madeline and I and the Campus Compact Network to some broader action that's immediately beneficial to you in your work in your daily life.
So I noticed, I'll just do this quickly. I noticed that at the end of the first session, there was a sort of a written recap. And I was thinking what might be interesting as we go back through the recordings of these various sessions is to think about doing a very deliberate interweaving of middle state standards and these Campus Compact conversations, maybe even pulling out some of the examples that were mentioned and provide links to those locations. Because I'm very much mindful, as Dr. Ward mentioned, that the ways in which we can have specific takeaways or examples to illustrate the ideas that we've been discussing, the more useful I think these materials might be for those who are listening in.
From the standpoint of the commission, we encourage our members to share such information. We often ask our members to, as they're going through self-study, to look at other institutions, ask for that information. And our member institutions are amazingly collegial. So there may not be a database of some of these resources, but there are kind of touch points, people that are doing good work. And almost without fail, they are willing to share information about that work. So Michelle mentioned earlier about something that resonated with me about going to meet the community at their point of need. And that's kind of what we encourage our institutions to do, is to meet people at their point of need. So based on your mission, based on your goals, how are you going to achieve that at that point where you can impact your students, but also impact your other constituencies?
Wonderful. This has absolutely been rich. And Dr. Peterson Saul from New Jersey, my marvelous colleague, your questions are outstanding, and the panelists, I can't thank you enough. I feel like this is literally just the beginning of a conversation. So we will certainly continue. For all of those of you who are participating, albeit listening in, you may have many of those examples that can be shared with other colleagues here. So would you kindly reach out to us and share how you know and how you show. And I also want to mention that our next workshop, our next webinar will be utilizing the Carnegie Civic Engagement Classification application to support self-study and accreditation, of course, with middle states. And that will be Thursday, April 22nd from 11 to 12. So please, if you are yourselves not able to participate, please strongly encourage another representative from your campus so we can continue the conversation. Thank you so much.